Hi, I'm Claire Bennie. I'm Director of Municipal, which is an organisation which helps public sector landowners to make the most of their land.
From Ackroyd Lowry, I'm Oliver Lowry.
And I'm John Ackroyd.
And this is Urban Forecast, a show where we talk to the people defining the future of our cities. We discuss their background, what drives them, and the insights they've learned along the way.
This is a podcast for anyone who's interested in how we live, work or play in the cities of the future, and what that means for the built environment today.
So Claire, thanks so much for joining us today. We obviously know each other from various different events and have met a few times in the past, but it'd be great for our audience if you could give us the potted history of how you got to be doing what you're doing at the moment.
Fantastic. So I started life as an architect, studied at Bath University and the Mac, practiced for about 12 years, and towards the end of that I was an associate at Procter & Matthews Architects, really inspiring group of people to be with. And I got really into housing, but what frustrated me as an architect was that my clients seemed to actually have more influence over what went up, what was happening, what you named the building, how you designed it, and so forth. And I very foolishly probably thought I'd like to do that role instead when I was in my mid-30s. And of course, I didn't know what on earth I was doing and what it meant to be a developer at all. But luckily, that didn't stop me from completely changing my career. So I went to Peabody and actually did some research for them for a while to break myself in. And then I worked for Peabody's asset management team. And it's interesting, people think, oh, Peabody's a developer. But of course, actually, first and foremost, it's a landlord. It now owns 100,000 homes, I think. So basically, Peabody is a town. And of course, those buildings need a lot of looking after. And they've been around since 1862. And so really, my education there was, what does it mean to look after tens of thousands of buildings for 150 years, which is a fantastic prelude to becoming a development person. So I spent a couple of years in what's called their asset management team, helping them to spend about 150 million refurbishing their existing stock. A really fantastic education, as I say. And then I was able to be very fortunate to join their development team, which was almost starting from scratch because they'd been through so many kind of issues with their own stock at that time. And I was so lucky to be able to build a team up from 2 to 30 during sort of 2008 to 2015. And we gradually picked up from 200 homes a year to 1,000, which was a really exciting pipeline to run. It's a bit strange that I start with the numbers because actually what was most important to me was to carry on the Peabody legacy of actually making fantastic buildings to live in, which had a certain rigor to them and which were going to last a long time. And I hope that I've left some of those buildings behind with my fantastic team. Left Peabody in 2015 and took a year off. And as part of that year off, I visited 70 housing schemes around Europe. I did a 4,500 mile trip on the train. And by the way, as an adult, you can interrail. It's £500 a month and it's a total bargain. So I visited 20 cities and blogged about the 70 housing schemes that I saw. And that was extremely helpful and refreshing for the work I was going to do next. So the last 7 years, really, what I've been doing, I worked for or with Igloo Regeneration on a project in Swindon, which is just about to open its first phase, helping them to get planning for 240 odd homes out in Swindon, which was, again, a fantastic education for me. It's lower rise, suburban, as opposed to the urban work I've mostly been doing. And I learned a hell of a lot about what it takes to do something in a lower value, lower rise area. And then for the last 5 or so years, I've been working with local authorities and other public sector organisations really to help them understand how they get a better quality product at the end. There's a lot of councils now doing housing, as well as HAs and some sort of other organisations like DC and TfL. And really, I'm all about what is your organisation doing? What's your processes? What's your people? How do you procure? How do you scrutinise the projects as they go along? And I've written a book about that for the GLA, and that book is essentially my calling card, and I help all kinds of public sector organisations see where it is in the whole chain of doing a project where the quality kind of drops away, and I help them to perhaps pick that back up again.
Amazing. And just, do you want to plug your book? Because I just downloaded it, and it's because you don't have to buy it. There's a PDF copy of it.
There is
online.
a PDF online, indeed. I always like to have a little A5 book in my handbag because I find just being able to pick something up and look at it really helpful. So for my clients, I've sent them all a hard copy book, and it's called Delivering Quality Homes Handbook. And it basically goes through 4 themes, which are culture and people. So these are the 4 things that public sector organisations have at their fingertips to get quality. And just before I talk about those, actually, what's so important is that really, if you're a council making homes and you're the development director of that programme, you've got the most power, the most control, the most influence and ability to make something fantastic quality. Of course, using a nice architect or using a nice landscape architect is a great idea, but actually they get their budget from you, their direction from you, their specification from you. So even having a great architect, if you don't know what to do with them, then that's a problem. My 4 levers that I give to councils and co are culture and people. Have you got leaders? Is somebody championing it? Does anyone care if someone does quality? So if your job description or your yearly tasks don't say, by the way, you've got to, the residents have all got to say it's fantastic, or it's got to win an award, or whatever it is, then you won't be incentivized to do it. You'll just be incentivized to finish it on time and on budget, which, by the way, is also important. But the rewards tend to come for those bits and nothing to do with quality. So all of that culture and people stuff, absolutely foundational. Without that, the other 3 levers don't even work. And the other 3 levers are a good brief and standards. If you set your architects and your other design team members a really good, ambitious brief, then you get procurement, which is just a mess in a lot of public sector organisations. People plug all sorts of things into spreadsheets and then they let a computer almost pick their third-party partners, and it's those third-party partners, whether they're designers or builders, who are going to be absolutely instrumental to the quality of what you do. So it's important to be really present as a public sector developer in the procurement of the people that you think meet your values and are going to achieve what you want. So I do a lot of help with various organisations to make sure that the questions they ask and the process they use actually get to high quality people. And very finally, the 4th theme is stewardship, and by that scrutiny. A lot of people think you can almost give a design team and a contractor a project and press a button and then see them at the end. I know that's a slight mischaracterisation, but of course you've got to be there scrutinising, got to get external people scrutinising as well, communities, and you've got to do everything like getting fantastic sample panels, and then when you see them on site saying, no, I don't want that. So you've got to be completely, again, present as the project manager from that council or HA, otherwise you're not going to get a fantastic quality thing. So that's the book in a nutshell, and it's got 50 bits of advice in it basically, and it may be about to be used by the GLA as part of their funding round, so that if you ask the GLA for £50 million as an HA, what the GLA is going to do is say, read this book and choose 10 of these 50 things to improve in your business. That's not certain yet, but that may happen in the next few months.
Amazing. And how will that be measured then? Is there going to be some sort of qualitative?
I feel they have to make an action plan. So if you want all their money, you have to say, we're going to do these 10 things, going to do it by this time, and this is what we're going to do, and it's going to cost this. And then the GLA, as they always do, have quarterly meetings with all their partners where they say, have you finished yet? And how much did it cost? And they're also going to be saying, and have you made your new ERs, or have you appointed a design champion, or have you reformatted how you write project briefs, or whatever the 10 things are that they've been asked or they've volunteered. The really important thing is HAs are stupidly busy, as I'm sure people listening to this know, and the project managers don't want yet another thing to be measured on. So I was really determined that it wasn't going to be a sort of stick that to beat people with, you've got to do these 50 things, and if you don't, then you're a loser. It's more kind of, why don't you decide to self-select 10 things which you wanted to sort out anyway, and then use this as a vehicle to do that.
Amazing. I'm just going to take a slight pause because that's nice. Sorry, it's all right. That's good. That was really good. Very good. And I had made some notes and realised that's what I was like. Wait, she's come there.
It's nice and warm. Given the single glazing.
We will replace that eventually.
I'm living with it. Oh God, no.
The bits with Jamie will double days, but it's
Yeah, it's like the thought that we have to keep repairing every time we finish one thing, another thing breaks.
Yeah.
And so the next thing I was going to talk about was sort of other roles, and then the kind of the stuff that you're doing right now on Municipal. Is that
Yeah, sure.
right?
Yeah.
And then I was going to go on to the sort of the discussion around current
Article,
policy
yeah.
and that article.
Yeah.
If you're okay with that.
Yeah, I may be more or less eloquent about any number of those, but let's see. It's easy to talk about yourself.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic history. I think it'd be great to talk about some of the other roles that you've got, both with the Mayor Design Review, the roles that you have, and then also what you're currently really excited about at Municipal.
Sure. So I'm a mayor's design advocate. I think there are 40 of us, and we're there to make sure the London plan not just happens, but happens in a good way. So we get involved in policy, we get involved in writing documents, doing workshops, and doing design review. And in fact, I was chair of the Mayor's Design Review for the Tulip, which I won't talk about here because it's confidential. However, I can confirm that it was a fascinating review with many facets to think about, including what is a viewing tower and what are the ones around the world which are successful and which aren't. So yes, that's about as far away from housing as you can possibly get, but it was a very interesting exercise. I also do design review for some people called Design Southeast, and it's local authorities such as Kingston and Brighton. They're my main two authorities, have schemes which are going into planning, and they ask the developer to pay for a design review, and then I chair a panel of 4 or 5 people, which includes landscape, sustainability, transport. We crit the scheme, and hopefully it then becomes better before it actually hits the planners' desks. So that is interesting. And what am I doing now? So I've got, I guess, 5 things going on at the moment. I'm working with Homes England, which is really exciting, helping them to improve their sustainability and design processes. A lot of people may not know that they don't develop land as such, but they get outline planning consents on public land, a lot of it, hundreds of sites. And during that process, obviously, there are a lot of decisions to make about design, sustainability, and so forth. And what we're doing is reviewing some of those decision points and just making sure that design and sustainability comes up the chain and that it's not overly financially driven, or it's driven very much by both at the same time. So that's a long-term project and incredibly exciting. And I know Homes England are refocusing what they do at the moment. I'm also working with Winchester Council. They're redeveloping a really exciting site in the town centre, or I should say the city centre. And they are in the process of choosing a developer at the moment. And I've been helping them alongside some other people to get that decision right. And that's equally been fascinating. And it's equally always the pull and push between the financial and the quality side of things, and I'm there to stand up for the quality party whilst understanding the money, which is quite a useful thing. I'm also working with Be First Regeneration and helping them to procure their new panel of architects. And then recently, I've also been working with a private sector developer to help an Oxbridge college to pick the right architect for that scheme, but that's confidential at the moment beyond what I've told you there. The other thing that I've just launched this week is the Architect Directory, which is a directory of all architects in London who have designed housing, and it's searchable by the borough, by awards, by turnover, by female directorship, BAME directorship, etc. And there are 853 firms, I think, on the directory at the moment, and it is now live, architectdirectory.co.uk. And really, I did that for 2 or 3 reasons, really. One was my clients, my public sector clients, were saying, we can't see which architects are out there, what they can do. Or they say, we'd like to run a competition where we have only female BAME-led practices in this borough, and then I just do my algorithm and it says there aren't any. So and the other critical one for clients is turnover. They say it must be over 10 million, and I show them how many architects there are, and it's only about 5% of that 850 whatever. I think it's only about 50. So it's also a teaching tool to say, do you know, if you have a firm of 10 architects, they can actually design your 200 unit scheme, no problem. So it's there for all kinds of reasons, but it also means that architects can compare themselves to their peers and think, oh, hang on, we're not doing quite as well on these measures, and not necessarily turnover, because people choose different business sizes to be, maybe the diversity staff and other things, and it can just help them to see how they compare. So that's this week's exciting thing.
Yeah, you've got enough time to do it.
I made that one during lockdown because I had slightly less business than I normally would have for all the obvious reasons. And so in all the cracks in between working, I collected all of that data, which means that I've now looked at 1,000 architects' websites, and I can tell you quite a lot of them leave something to be desired. But
Website,
Yeah,
so it's left behind.
it does. It's always like a couple of years behind where the practice is, and that's
Yeah, I think the stuff that we're working on now is never the stuff that we can publicise necessarily. So it's
Indeed,
sort of like the
it is
website's a little
behind.
window on a year ago, because
yeah,
the most recent stuff is a pre-application stage and we can't necessarily publicise it.
yeah, no, I totally get that. My own website's at least a year behind in terms of what I'm doing.
So how do you, just out of interest, how do you get the data then for like?
It's all in the public domain, really. So companies' house, people's websites. I can't precisely pinpoint somebody's turnover, but I can see how many employees they've got, and
That's what,
I can see there's some data that I leave to the architects themselves to put in because it's too sensitive.
Update it.
You can,
go,
yeah.
oh, that's not quite right. We
Indeed.
can show that we're
Exactly.
over more or less or
There we are.
whatever, and we've got this great consent.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I check it now and then to make sure people aren't making any wild claims or using swear words on the website.
Oh,
Yeah.
pulls us out.
I thought this was a pro swearing podcast, isn't it?
Oh, it's totally, yes,
Swear away.
you're going to have that little E symbol next to it.
Yeah.
No, I promise I'll try not to.
I think the reason that we wanted to have this conversation today is that you wrote a very interesting article on LinkedIn, which I think I said that I agreed with almost everything.
That
And
never happens, by the way.
yeah, I never agree with everything 100%. But no, I thought it would be really interesting to talk about. I think just before we started, I've got a quote. This is from Michael Gove, which might set the scene. This is Michael Gove's maiden speech in his return as Levelling Up / Housing Secretary. If we do make sure that in the planning reforms we're bringing forward, people understand that new homes will be beautiful, that they'll be accompanied by infrastructure, there will be democratic decision making, there will be environmental enhancement, and that we will be creating new neighbourhoods, then we can build new homes and additional infrastructure that this country needs to power the growth to which we are all committed. And as with some things that Michael Gove said, there's really very little that you can disagree with that. And so I think what you were saying is, I think it was Policy Exchange have said lots of placemaking is bad. And I think we can agree with that as well. But then they've said the reason for that is, and then prescribed a load of.
So there's two things that are wrong. So you get the statement, places are not that great, which I can agree with, like you say, and I agree with a lot of what Gove said in that statement, which goes around that. But there are two things that follow. Why is that and what shall we do? And the why is that and what should we do are both wrong in the Policy Exchange document, in my view. And because I'm all about how does the public sector or people in the world really get better quality, I just thought I can't bear the idea of a massive investment in a whole new school of architecture or a school of urban design, which is what they really want, which I understand, which I think would be a waste of time and wouldn't actually solve some of the underlying problems. The reason why we don't get great places basically is a number of reasons, but one of the keys that underlies it all is land economics, especially in the UK. Developers are trying to buy land and they have to pay an awful lot for it. Now, why is that? Because there's it's quite scarce, especially the stuff that's not in Greenbelt and so forth. If it's scarce, then people are all going to be chasing after it. And who's going to win it? The person that can pay the landowner the most. So the developer's thinking, I've now paid 20 million for that piece of land. What can I sell everything for when I've finished this development? I can sell it all for 50 million. So I've now got 30 million left to pay for the buildings, fees, have my profit, all of that kind of thing. And actually just the sheer maths of that, if you pay a lot for the land, that just squeezes down what you can pay for everything else. So we've already got a situation, and of course the developers already paid a lot because they're competing against peers. So we've now got a situation where the developer has paid a lot, has got no money to spend, and there are controls against that. So of course we've got planners that say you can't just build a cardboard box, it has to be better than that. Building regulations obviously stop that as well. And in theory, consumer choice stops that. If they build something terrible, or if somebody made a terrible phone or table or whatever it was, nobody'd buy it. But homes are different. Everybody's desperate for a home, and they're desperate, quite a lot of people, for a new build home. And it's seemingly, and I almost don't understand why, people are prepared to put up with something that's not that great, not particularly well built, not something with really nice public space outside it. They will buy a sort of 3-bedroom, very tight box with 2 parking spaces outside and no front garden and all those other things. And they're absolutely fine with that. And so my point is, if that's the world we're in, then developers are not going to try and do something much more sustainable with a lot of public space, nice green spaces and features and so forth. It won't really happen. So it's really that business of land economics and the fact that planners can't sit there and say, no, we don't like it, it's not good enough, it hasn't got all these kind of social spaces and things that make community and so forth in it. They don't demand it. Either the policy is not demanding it, or more importantly, the people don't have the kind of remit and resources and so forth to really direct that well. And as we know, building regs are quite weak as well. Horrendous stories which have come out, like Grenfell Tower and so forth, just mean that even that is not protecting the public against the lowest possible spend on a building. So we're in a bit of a pickle in this country, and it really isn't anything to do with architects being educated. Now, I've said that. However, we have all been educated as architects, the 3 of us sitting around this table. And I think my education at Bath and the MAC was quite interesting and quite good. And actually at Bath especially, a lot of training in engineering in particular. I had to do lighting, acoustics, building physics and so on for 4 years. And I was actually educated with the engineers and found that extremely stimulating and useful. But I think there are a lot of architecture courses which don't really teach urban design, i.e. how you make something much bigger than just a few houses. And I think also architecture education can be very abstract, very focused on creativity at the expense of realism. Now, there's always an argument made. It's the 5 years in which you're going to be extremely creative and have fun and let your imagination run wild. But actually, most 98% of architects will be working on projects with a client that is very constrained in terms of their cash, with a site that's very particular, and just in an economic and political environment which doesn't let you run away with your imagination. So I think it would be so much better if architects could be taught in a somewhat different way, and not just that, but if they could be taught alongside planners, alongside developers, i.e. surveyors, and really come to understand the to and fro and the push and pull of where each one is going to find its priorities and so forth. So I, in a sense, do welcome the idea that education can do with an improvement. I don't think it's a brand new school of slightly old.
School for developers. Developers don't. There's no standard qualification required to be a developer.
It's an RICS, but
not to be a developer. Like all you need.
No,
is
you don't
money.
need to. Yes, all you do need is some money. That's correct.
Lots of developers that we work with are not, they're not PLCs, so they don't have to come through the development route, like the surveying route. So surely, if you're going to prescribe a school for anyone, a school for developers.
But why would they go to it? Because if the planners are not
in the same way that we have to go to architecture school to qualify.
Oh, I see. You have to go through.
That's another idea.
Yeah.
As you say, who's really responsible for the placemaking? Is it the architect, or is it the developer who buys the site and gives the brief?
It's both. It's planners as well.
But only 2 of those 3 have to go to university.
I agree. I think it's to say just to build a new university or whatever. It seems a bit of a kind of. It sounds just playing to the crowd a little bit and not really addressing the problem for me. We found that as we set up what we call the Aquilary Academy, which is about our team training and kind of thought leadership and developing the skills when they come out of university that they don't have to actually operate with clients and contractors and the planners or all the rest of it. So I think it is a problem, but I think you need to change the culture in a lot of architecture schools and things to actually impact that bit. And like you say, it's only 1/3 of the problem or whatever. It does need addressing, but it's 1/3 of the problem.
Indeed.
And if you don't change the other bits, it's completely pointless.
Even higher up, it's that you get. I don't think planners, obviously planning authorities are underfunded, but I think most planners that are in the public sector aren't in that game for the money. They're in it because they believe in good places, and I think that they do push for design quality sometimes, and I think that should be admired, but the system doesn't allow them to holistically exert control over a place. So it's red line thinking. So they're only allowed to judge one red line site on its own yes, there could be a master plan, but really what the planners need, or the system should encourage, is for the red lines to be dissolved a bit more, so that you can understand a place outside of just its red line.
Agreed, which is legally very different.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Nicholas Boyd-Smith talks a lot about how planning's broken in this country because we simply cannot impose a kind of massive master plan on an area unless there is, you can suggest one, but unless there is a single land ownership, which is why people like King Charles and various others, the Crown Estate and the area around King's Cross and so forth, were so fortunate, or the Cambridge University, because there's a huge single land ownership where the person in control actually does care about all that and does care about the long term. But that's a very rare circumstance. You look at somewhere like Nine Elms and there were, I don't know how many, 15 landowners, and they're not going to say, oh, I'll have the 4-story bit on my site. This just doesn't work.
We've seen that so many times, actually, when you get kind of fragmented master plan and all oh, you can have the park and the 4-story bit. Well, we want the 25-story bit. And it just becomes an impossible go.
Indeed.
And there's no real way to equalise it or deal with it or anything. It's very complicated. I'm not saying it's impossible, and you get stuck in the thing. But and you also find that the local plan is always out of date and the kind of thing that was there 10 years ago or whatever that is attached to it, and the SPG, and it sort of becomes irrelevant. So it's quite hard for the planners to do their job.
Something where Homes England can step in and start acquiring the sites on some mathematical basis and putting them together into a large parcel.
It does do quite a lot of that as it happens, mostly not in urban situations, or it's actually looking to move more into the urban environment now. Yeah.
A bit on the land economics point, because I think it's a very important one. No, it's just that, I don't know, somewhere like Holland has probably even more constrained land supply than the UK.
They make more of it, don't forget. They seriously do.
They build out and they build up and they do things, but they've got a kind of reputation for better quality housing than the UK. And I'm just wondering what ingredient, and I know some of this, they will still have developers buying sites for high prices, and they still need to sell them.
No, it's really weird. And I don't know exactly how it works in Holland, I'm going to say that now, but when I was in Sweden, where again they have more proactive planning in both those countries and a much more understood way of building. There are various standard details that the contractors use out there. So the architects draw things, and I'm having number 5, number 6, and number 7, and everybody just knows how to build the details. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that when the public sector is selling sites, the public sector nearly always master develops. So they not only just flog sites, they get an outline consent on it, and they're very clear about what they want. And when they come to sell a plot, they will say, we need 10 million euro for this plot. That's done. We don't want you to compete on that. 10 million is what's going to make us break even or whatever it is. Now the 4 of you can compete on quality alone. That's it. And I'm like, fantastic. But we've got a bit of legislation here, which means that the public sector is, in theory, not really allowed to do that in this country. It has to ask people to bid the best consideration. Now, even that is disputed. There are some lawyers in this country who say best price is also involves social and environmental factors. So if I've gone and got myself a planning consent with all sorts of conditions on it, which say you must be zero carbon, it must be this, that, and the other, then actually the best price you can get with those constraints in place is obviously a bit less. Sure, you could sell it to Persimmon for 10 million, but actually you've done an outline and you want it zero carbon, and you've said that as the public sector, that's only 5 million now. But the legislation's a bit grey, and various, whether you're a local authority, Homes England, or some other public authority, the legislation's different for all these bodies. So it's very difficult. And I see
top down in that case, because we were talking
Michael
about
Gove would make that decision. And in fact, I think there is something that's gone to him recently saying, could we have a re-look at how the public sector can use its land to achieve more than just of the biggest receipt possible? It can achieve its social and environmental aims as well. So that's out there.
We're at the moment in between policies that Gove's trying to get through the House. Could you imagine him adopting that? He can't seem to be able to get his own levelling up bill. I'm just going to check all the things are recording properly, by the way.
That'd be quite funny.
No, well, it's being recorded in three different ways. So there's always we've got quite a lot of build, what do you call it, resilience. So that's connected to that. This is then also recording. Yeah, good. Oh, I'm not in it. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. Oh, no, I am. That's good. And then this is also recording, so got a
Great.
few fail safes in place.
Yeah, great.
Where were we?
Michael Gove.
Slagging off Michael Gove.
No, I can't do
Can't
that.
get it for his house. He couldn't get his reforms. Well, the government tried to bring through lots of different.
Well, yeah, that's what I want to get to, is watering down his own policies on. Okay, so.
Well, yeah, the forest. So what we should, because also we've had a series of different types of Conservative administration.
Oh, you should ask a question about Simon.
You want to be a bit careful. It's a sort of chat house.
No, but you can say that it happened, and you can say that Simon Clarke he's been very open about his views about pro-growth and the need for the Conservatives to support more pro-housing. Michael Gove, on the other hand, appears to have just passed.
No, I don't want to say that because you don't want to get in between Michael Gove and Simon Clarke. That's not our job. Look, I was there with him. It's not what I want to do. We're trying to talk to Tories. We haven't talked to them as much before. Not now getting in their arguments, but I think cut that bit. So going back to where we were just talking about.
Do you want to start with the question?
Yeah. So what's really interesting is obviously the government has had various initiatives and sort of policies, including the Delivering Up Bill, which I think is in the House at the moment. What are your thoughts on these, and do you think they're going to actually lead to any positive change in the kind of housing supply and the housing quality?
Housing quality, I'm not sure. I think the business of getting rid of the targets is already proving difficult because some councils are saying, great, we won't build anything then. And
That's what
I think that is going to be an issue. I'm not sure I've got much more to say.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Sorry.
I think recently, so the National Design Guide, when the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission started their work, I was a bit scared of some of the things they were talking about. However, the National Design Guide, I actually thought was a very good document, quite helpful. I think it has good precedents.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? It says lots of great things, but it's like motherhood and apple pie, isn't it? It's like, who would disagree with that? Which seems to be the sort of catchphrase of the day, doesn't it? It's got 149 clauses or something, and I haven't really seen it yet used to improve something. So
we used it to improve the graphics of our documents because we've matched up the different 10 pillars with the 10 sections in our documents. So it's quite helpful for that, for our design and access statements.
Okay, it orders documents.
It's not critical thought, is it? And I find sometimes also with these things that I mean, in Gove's recent statement, he was talking about Ambry again, and it's like Ambry is a very specific thing. It doesn't really apply to most of the work we do in any shape or form in terms of urban regeneration and everything else. And you can make your own opinion up about the quality of some aspects of that scheme, but I think how do we? Yeah, I mean, for me at the moment, what I'm seeing with a lot of our clients, the feeling I get is over-regulation, but lack of kind of certainty and positive kind of incentive. No one can disagree that you need to improve the building regs, that you need to improve, I don't know, environmental design and everything else. Is it the quite kind of hodgepodge of different kind of regulations in different places? And it can be quite overwhelming for anyone, be a developer, architect or local authority. And so for me, there is something needed in terms of simplifying that, but also incentivizing those people to do it. Because we're seeing now in London, particularly, viability on schemes not being met, or like almost on every scheme. And then the local authority gets stuck because the developers are now saying our build costs have gone up, our exits have not gone up. We've got a sort of problem here and we can't deliver our 35% or whatever else. And then they want to go back into kind of simplify things because of their cost problems. So it comes back to your land economics point. How do we overcome that without just, and I'm not saying you have the answer, and if we did, we'd all be very happy. So it is a sort of interesting problem we're heading into, that we've got a lot more regulation coming in. We've also got prices going up.
There'll be a structural change in the land market at some point, and it will take a little while to get there. But obviously everybody's been paying market price for land, but now that build costs have gone up massively, and as you say, we're cranking up sustainability, and then Sadiq Khan has cranked up affordable housing in London. Once you start turning all of those screws, as you say, it is complex, and I'm not sure we can get around that really. Then in the end, then the developers have paid too much for the land, in quotes, because it's not sustainable to build a policy compliant scheme. That will just take a while to trickle through the market, and then
there'll be a correction
in land price.
And then, going forward, it should then unlock at some point. Yeah.
Yes, you would hope so. But there's always the cycle in the market, and we're at the particularly bad one at the moment, which is nothing works. And yeah, you do have to make compromises if you want delivery, and that is always sustainability or affordable housing. There's almost no other factor, which kind of you can crank down, and obviously it's unpopular. But what's interesting is even before the kind of cost crisis, I think affordable housing was only running at something like 21% in most developments, and that's way under what it ought to be. So it's clear that inflated land prices were already being paid and compromises were already having to happen. So even if we were in a better situation than we are now, we've still got those issues, which, yeah, so.
Well, I think the boroughs that are being very strict about the 35% are finding that there's there's lots of consents and very little delivery. Don't want to name them. You know, the ones there's tons of consents that aren't being built out because everyone's like, now that the consents have gone through, people were saying yes to get it through, and then they're like, oh, actually.
But it's not deliverable now because of the build cost issue.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wait, or go back in for a different consent or whatever.
And then of course that then cranks building heights up, those different consents, and then is that right? Because if you had a 25-story building there before and you've now got a 32-story one, you know, really, is that you're going to have rights of light, so daylight sunlight problems and all sorts of other environmental problems.
And placemaking problems.
And placemaking
You're going
problems.
To, like, I think we've had an interesting breakfast where we had a couple of different heads of planning there, and one of the points made was that London attracts investment because it has value, and it has value because of the urban fabric that we've created over several hundred years. And it's quite easy to devalue that. And you get, at the moment, London has a positive cycle of investment because people want to live here because they want to live here because of the place. If you devalue the place by making everything placemaking worse, you'll get a negative spiral where suddenly, if all you do is create crap places, nobody wants to live here. So you get the unspirals and you get.
You say that. I know what you mean. It would be quite hard to ruin London. I've never said or thought anything about this before, so I don't know whether I'm right about this.
It's an interesting point.
It is an interesting point, of course. It's if you don't invest properly, then people won't be attracted anymore. But there's so many bits of London that you can't touch. But also, if you think about the city, and I know nobody lives in the city, or very few people do, that in the sort of late 80s, early 90s suddenly went bang and was a lot taller and much more sort of American or Middle East style, hasn't put people off at all. And it's partly because Peter Rees, when he was the chief planner in the city, really curated those buildings and made sure they were good quality and made a nice cluster. But of course that sort of broke a bit in the last few years and people were slightly frightened about that. And again, that's where the tulip comes back in. But so I think higher densities don't necessarily mean terrible places. It's just the quality of those higher densities. You look at Toronto, my mum lived there in the 50s. It was a kind of low-rise hick town, not doing very much, but now it's like the financial capital of Northeast America's American continent, and it builds an astonishing amount of new homes every year, and they're all in towers, like 90% or something of them in towers. I don't necessarily agree with it. They are totally banging ahead with that as a strategy, and not just in the town centre, central business district, but across a huge plain. And people are still moving there and want to live there, and they go to the cute lower rise bits and they live in the high rise, which is outside. And so I never want to say never about that kind of strategy. What I think I struggle with is that quite a lot of the high rise buildings in London really are not great quality flats. They haven't got all the kind of amenities in that you might want and also with higher rise buildings, they cost a lot more to build and they cost a lot more to maintain. And I think that they're really only suitable for people with a lot of money, and that might sound controversial, but I do think that they're a luxury product and they should be rare and they should be extremely high quality, and then that's it. People don't really actually want to live in them. Most people, probably about 5% of people without kids, people with a reasonable amount of money, and people with a huge kind of mobility in life. I think for everybody else, it's just a pain.
But it's different in Paris and New York and places, and I know there's a slightly different, but a lot of people live in apartments there in the centre of town compared to probably to the UK. It's changed. It's quite common to live in a tower block in central New York in comparison to.
Oh, in New York, sure.
Yeah, and Paris has a kind of higher density on the whole with its sort of 7-8 story kind of treatment of a lot of it.
But it's tiny, Paris. If you actually superimpose it on London, it's 3 boroughs or something. It's nothing. So you can walk through it. And 7 or 8 stories is very different to living at floor 22 when your window breaks and nobody can come and fix it because it's on the whatever floor. Yeah, I don't haven't done enough, or not me, I haven't seen enough or done enough research to know definitively whether high-rise is or isn't a good idea. My gut tells me that it's problematic, and there's an event at the LSE on February the 7th, which everyone should go to on that very topic. But I think there's so many people doing it and making it work, and Melbourne's the other place, and Vancouver, that somebody must have their maths and their livability right. So I don't want to dismiss it out of hand.
Yeah, I was just going to change it slightly. Yeah. So I think my initial response to go back to your sort of article, and I said that I agreed and disagreed with parts of it. I think what the government are trying to achieve in talking about design codes and like making development more palatable, I think is geared towards Tory vote. This is my assumption, which tend to be suburban and countryside people, and then urban places tend to be Labour. And that's, if you just look at local elections, that will be supported by that sort of voting patterns. All of the things they're saying are to try and protect greenbelt and village development, and that's why they're like, oh, it should all be like Poundbury, because what they don't want is modern-looking things scattered amongst the leafy boroughs.
Yeah.
But I think really, if we're trying to do sustainable development, we shouldn't really be developing those areas anyway. Brownfield urban sites are fundamentally going to be more, the infrastructure is better, they're going to be more sustainable. There's plenty of brownfield sites, so we should be going urban first, brownfield first.
But weirdly, people don't really want to live there. I know that some people want to live in urban areas, younger people looking for careers and jobs and but actually, once people have families or get older, my understanding is they really don't want to live in a flat in Farringdon or whatever, they just don't. So it still remains the home of choice is a house somewhere in the home counties, no, not just the home counties, in areas outside the main central bit of cities. And indeed, that's what's mostly delivered. If you look at, I can't remember what the proportion is now, but something like 75% of homes are houses in the shires. They are not flats in London or Manchester. And that's for all kinds of reasons. Land is cheaper and all sorts of things. And also with people working from home now, you do not need to live in the city anymore. So I'm not convinced that people will still go there for jobs and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm not sure what the future of that is. So I think we're still going to be building homes. The best homes I've seen in Holland, for instance, are like in Utrecht. They've got Utrecht sitting there, but they've also got a massive 32,000 home suburb just outside it, with detached, bit of terrace, a few flats here and there, but the landscape in between is just beautiful. And the play and the shared amenities, the green spaces, the canals, you name it, it's all going on there. And that's, I wish Gove and Co would actually just go to Holland and look at a bunch of things, because you don't have to do weird historic pastiche in order for people to really get on board and like things.
But I think the rhetoric is around a high housing crisis. So yes, there might be demand for people to live in certain particular areas, but there's also lots of demand that just cannot simply buy a house. And
there are decent houses in London. I think more people. The point is that who can afford to buy a property in London that's not a tiny box or whatever? So the point that most of the people I know would much rather live centrally, even with families and things, but they can't. It's just an impossibility. It's just.
I think you know a very particular crowd in that case, because I don't think that's a lot of people's aspiration.
I do think you're right. There's people. I mean, I've got a young family and everything, else. But I do think the reason why people don't live in London is primarily because it's impossible to buy a house in London. But if you went to even Cambridgeshire or outside, you suddenly can be able to have your own house, yes, with 2 cars on your front door and a bit of space. Whereas in London, you're going to get a very poor quality, small place with no outdoor space. Why would you want that? No one would want that. There isn't much provision for affordable quality accommodation in London. So you'll feel bang for buck if you go live in Essex or Bedfordshire or anywhere else. You're going to get such a better property.
And you may not need to commute much anymore either. Great.
So you're saying people want to live further out, and John's saying they're driven further out. And if there was more supply in,
I think they actually want to live. Oh yeah, they're driven. So if you had,
by the cost.
If you had, but you're not gonna.
But they might accept a flat if it was a better quality flat. If there was more supply, it would bring down prices.
I live in an estate, 240 flats. 50 people must have left during the pandemic. Barren. The minute people thought, my God, I don't have to live here anymore. I love my estate. My flats where I live are lovely.
No, but the Cotswolds is full of people with buyer's regret now. who are coming back to London because they
Well,
don't
this
like
is
it
a
in their
subject.
I don't think we've got
this
the
is-
data.
This is a subjective thing that we can all think, and depending about your echo chamber and who you talk to, you can probably come to different conclusions.
Yeah.
But one of the things I think is a fact is we've got a kind of biological crisis and a wildlife and outdoor crisis in the UK. And if we keep on building on all our green spaces and don't protect them more, for me, that is only going to get worse. So I do think there's a
But
thing.
we've only built on a very small percentage of land, really. I know it doesn't feel like it, but when you actually look at the data of land that's got a building on it, it's naff all, really.
But then you create but we started this conversation on saying that land's scarce.
It's because it's green belt. There's just loads of
So
green
you think
belt.
we should be building on the green belt?
Well, okay.
That's probably the most controversial thing you said in
Yeah.
one podcast.
I'm all for making the green belt more green. I think it should be trees and
Yeah, but some of the green belt's rubbish, isn't
it's
it?
totally
Yeah.
rubbish. It's not really green. It's halfway. Most of it. There is some good bits. But my point is, the green belt isn't really green belt. The green belt should be more green,
Wild.
as in it should be more wild and more green, and there should be more, and there should be quite a high penalty for trying to build on anything, in a way which would try and change the incentive demands. And this is so that it becomes cheaper to build. It's any refurb is taxed at 20% because you pay VAT on it. It's mad. So already to build a new home in London becomes more expensive than to build one in the countryside. Just on that 20% discount for building a new build on a countryside plot than refurbishing a house in London. So immediately that's an incentive to build on greenfield or on new plots or completely demolish and rebuild. So I think for me there needs to be, that's what I'm just thinking, that not everyone's going to need different solutions for different things, but if the incentives are set in the wrong way, which I think they are, they have an important part to play, as well as sort of regulation of good building regs, good planning, good everything else. But people struggle to keep up with the different regulations, whereas they'll, incentive-led things, people always follow what they think's best for them, if you like.
Yeah.
How should we wrap this up? We've done over an hour now. How should we bring this back to a conclusion?
I think it's talking about where Claire's work's going and where we can, how can we drive quality in placemaking and housing. You're doing it with it already, aren't you?
I know, exactly. I'm just trying to think what I can say that's positive. There is that, but
Well, it's that I'm just going to talk because I just think one of the challenges, obviously, with all these economic and other things, how do we try and still make sure we get quality housing and with the challenges we've got? And maybe it just comes back to your book of those 4 points still remain relevant even in an economic downturn or whatever. We've got to protect our built environment and ensure that we create better quality spaces.
I think to me it's a cultural point. We're still I need to think about this.
We can edit this though.
Yeah, I know. I think amongst planners, developers, whether they're public or private sector, and any number of other customers as well, I just think there are so many people that just aren't that trained in or fussed about quality. Now, I've been rude about planners there. They probably are, but they feel powerless to do anything about it. But I just think there's a big cultural point here. I remember speaking to some residents in a garden in Amsterdam, a communal garden. It was a mad communal garden because it was a huge park basically, and they just placed blocks of flats within this park with zero barrier between the residents and people walking through. So it was almost like a zoo of buildings. And I remember saying to one of the residents, "Oh, I'm English," and she burst out laughing. And I said, "What's so funny?" And she said, "Oh, the English wouldn't like it here at all. It's far too public, and the landscape is quite wild, and it's been beautifully designed." And so she just had this view, this external view, and this is just a member of the public. It's no one to do with architecture, that we were stuck in some slightly strange, very financially focused world, which we couldn't get out of. And the other thing that happened to me when I was in Europe was that a planner, I think, I was talking to someone for quite a long time about how they dealt with a bit of Sweden, I think it was. And after about 45 minutes of me asking questions and us having a really good to and fro about quality and price and all that kind of thing, and she just looked at me and said, "Claire, you do realise that for the last 45 minutes, you've been talking about money." And I said, "Oh my God." I said, "That's really weird because that's not how I see myself or what drives me." And she said, "Yes, but you've just been asking me, how on earth does this work financially, and what about the cost, and what about..." And I realised I had to really go back to my hotel room and almost cry, because I thought I've turned into someone that's obsessing about that because it's the only sort of dealing with that is the only route to quality in the UK, whereas she wasn't focused on it at all. She just had she's got to get
But
her.
I think to go back to your original point about what should change in the education system, I do think there should be an awareness of how things are afforded. If you don't have an interventionist government, which we don't, then you're going to have to work out how these things stack up financially. And I think it's for architects, like, we can still be creative, but we have to be creative within like a decent understanding of how the finances are going to work on things. Because otherwise you'll just bang your head against the brick.
Agreed. But I think the rules around what you can do with public sector land, I think, are critical. I agree that if you're in the private market, you're a private developer working on private land, you're going to just do what you can. And I don't think there's much, apart from some kind of magical cultural change around the customer or the developer themselves, that's going to incentivize better behaviour. But I think on public land, you've got the chance to do something amazing. And if we just had a rule that said the public sector can set the value of that land before it clogs it, and then say, please come and give me your best qualitative offer, and that offer can be written down and set in stone, and then that has to be delivered. Wow.
Yeah. So that's the big change you need. And that would help.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. But there's also just not enough public leaders, or private leaders for that matter, who care about this stuff. I think people still go, what is design? What is design quality? Sometimes the word design gets banned from institutions and HAs and so on, because it's like, that's a frightening expensive thing. And you have to use the word quality. And indeed, I had to use it in that GLA document, not because the GLA is frightened of design, but because it's a word that resonates with more people. So there's something about a quality culture that is absent from education and practice. And it's almost like it's shameful to be into quality because it costs money and it's wasteful and etc. It's a bit like British cooking or something, isn't it? It used to be amazing, and our restaurants, our elite restaurants, are incredible, but the average British sort of roadside restaurant is not known. And Aristotle said quality is not an act, it is a habit. And he was spot on, because we just don't have that feel for what is the most fantastically tasty meal or amazing looking housing. Indeed, we don't think it's that important. And I think to change that culture takes a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting. So maybe what we need is education in primary schools and schools rather actually the wider, because what you're saying is in England, design is seen as something you add on at the end if you've got enough money.
Yeah.
And not something that's a sort of inherent good quality.
Homes, at least.
Yeah.
Weirdly, people are very fussy about their cars or their phones or whatever, or they can be. They've got a sort of eye for some of that. But when it comes to their home, there's not that.
I think it's because it's the prices are eye-wateringly high in the UK, and everyone's just desperate to.
Also, do you think there is a thing that, like, even myself, I tend to prefer living in actual old properties, and so you get like a bias towards a kind of Victorian or a Georgian house, and then you get developers going, "Oh, we'll just build a new thing that looks old," and that sort of
misses the point.
Misses the point, but it kind of appeals to a certain market. And then you don't get any innovation because you're just over old things.
Yes, I have a feeling people's heating bills are going to make them slightly less turned on by.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming in. I think we should wrap up. I'll try to see if we can edit this down to under an hour. It was really interesting, and I could definitely keep talking. We will after we stop recording. So thank you very much again.
That's a pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe and give us a review, ideally a 5-star one. And if you want to know more, please go to ackroydlowry.com or follow us on Twitter @ackroydlowry and Instagram with the same. This podcast supports LandAid, the property industry charity that brings together the sector to deliver life-changing projects for young people who really need it. Visit www.landaid.org to find out how you can help end youth homelessness.